Hey there, my name is Anonsee Storyweaver, and this is an interview that I'm doing of my friend, Hannah Kolbeck. Hannah recently discovered that she has a brain tumor and will be undergoing surgery to stop it from progressing further. We decided to do this interview so that a record of her story could exist, both for her loved ones and for other trans folks. It's rare that we have knowledge of when we might pass, and even rarer that we get to dictate the stories told about us. I'm really glad that we're able to hear Hannah's story together. So, you transitioned at 35 and came out on New Year's Day of 2021. What was the catalyst for that?
Um, my path to transition is a fairly long one in a lot of ways, but I think it really starts when I was about 30. And what happened then was I went on Abilify, and that calmed the suicidal ideation, though it didn't at all change the fact that I was suicidal. But the removal of that ideation let me start to really think about myself. Let me start to think about what was working for me, what wasn't. And very quickly, one of the things I realized was, especially as my friend group and I had gotten to know more queer people, and my friend group expanded, and I started to see that specifically non-binary was an option. And so I pretty quickly said, okay, I'm going to use they, them. But there was a few things. One was it didn't do a lot for me. It didn't feel right. And on a bigger note, I was spending so much time at work, doing work, etc., like 50, 60 hours a week, that the fact that the one place that really just did not accept that, did not respect that, was work. And because they, them actually wasn't doing a lot for me, I didn't really fight back against that. And the result was that at work, those expectations of masculinity didn't really change. But what did change at that point was I started seeing a therapist. And that therapist specialized in gender and sexuality. And I didn't know going in kind of what I was looking for. In our first meeting, I just said, I think I have never been happy. I want to feel happiness. I don't know what it's like. I don't know what that experience is like. I just know that I'm not. And through her, I sort of started building up a picture of what hadn't been working for me for masculinity, and why non-binary didn't really fit. But what that all built to was when I want to say 32, I don't remember exact timeline. I was at the end of a 30-mile hike that I took every year on the solstice, with a coworker, and she, out of nowhere, just kind of rambling, started talking about how the women's channel at our work had a non-binary AFAB person, or maybe someone in the channel transitioned to non-binary. I don't remember. Anyway, and so they had gone through and worked to remove explicitly gendered language from anything, move everything to non-gendered. And like I said, I was out at work. And so after she told me that, I asked, like, well, I'm non-binary. Do I fit in that space? Can I join that space? And she immediately kind of clammed up, uncertain, and just kind of stammered out, like, I don't know, I will have to talk to people. And that moment of realizing how badly how badly what I wanted was to be in a community of women. Um, and at that same moment, having that sort of pulled away. Maybe not totally denied, but at the very least, like, I'm not sure you can have that really clarified that, oh, I know that transness exists in a much deeper way than I did earlier in my life. Um, I'm trans. Oh shit. But also in that space, I said, I'm trans, I'm a trans woman. Um, I don't think I'll ever transition because I'm not that dysphoric. And in retrospect, the problem was that I had never, as an adult at least, really known joy. I was very and hedonistic. I don't know what the word is. Anyway, um, but through that, I came out to my wife, who was immediately accepting. Um, but we had been talking for a long time, and we're in the middle of trying to have a kid. And so that was incompatible with transition. And so I just kind of said, okay, that's not really an option. I'm not going to think about that. Over the course of doing that, I started to recognize ways that that gender dysphoria manifested and started to get a better picture of the ways it was affecting me, as well as that process of trying to get pregnant not working. And at some point, we talked and basically said, okay, we need to give up on this because I need to transition. So with their help, I started hormones in July of 2020, especially because, like, for many other trans people, there was suddenly this, like, I have a period where I don't have to be in public. I don't have to exist as I'm going through this initial transition stage. So I got on hormones, like I said, in July of 2020. By the time by December of that year, I didn't have a lot of physical changes, but going on our HRT gave me some sort of internal permission to start trying out wearing a dress in private and trying out makeup in private and all these other little things. And I started to really recognize how much happier I was with that. Actually coming out had been a plan. And at that point, I think I came out to my parents towards the end of 2020, I want to say. No, actually, I came out to my parents before the pandemic hit. That's right. I came out at the end of 2019 to them. And they were also just immediately accepting. I told my mom first, and her first words to me were that she always wanted a daughter. And then I told my dad and kind of my second mom over dinner, and their immediate reaction was kind of a like, okay, what can we do for you? What needs to change? Which had been their reaction through my entire life anytime I came to them with this isn't working for me, for the most part, although I was very bad at recognizing that for a long time. The actual decision of when I publicly transitioned was very spur of the moment. I had kind of been like trying to figure out how I wanted to do it, what channels I wanted to go through, just all sorts of things. And at that point, I was very active on Twitter, and I had this moment on New Year's Day, this kind of internal joke of like, I saw someone make a joke about, New Year, new me, making fun of the phrase, because very often it is kind of ridiculous. It's like, oh yeah, I'm just going to make this decision to completely change myself, and then, that'll work. And so I made a post that was just New Year, New Me. Hi, my name is Hannah. Um, and immediately felt this immense flood of relief and this immense flood of amazement that I could much more comfortably go out in dresses. I could really stop thinking about, okay, what are situations where I need to mask? And one of the really nice things there was, because of the pandemic, because everyone really close to me was so accepting, there were very few places that I still needed to mask. I'm not sure there were any that I can actually think of. And so for all the time that it took me to get to transition, the process of actually transitioning was very sudden, very immediate, and very, for lack of a better word, easy relative to a lot of other people's experiences.
I'm really glad that you had that much support when you were coming out. So, you've mentioned to me before that you had kind of an idyllic childhood, at least for a trans kid. Could you elaborate more on what you mean by that, or what you feel your parents did right?
Yeah, I feel like I really did have an idyllic childhood, not only in trans ways, but also in neurodivergent ways. And the real summary of that, the theme through it, is that when my parents saw that something wasn't working for me, they changed it. They didn't always get it right, but they kept trying until things worked better. And they took clues, they did research. My dad has a master's in developmental psych. My mom, and also taught preschool. My mom owned a home daycare that she started to take care of me and a group of other people. And over the course of my life, I saw how she was a really mom figure to a lot of people, including as after they had aged out of her preschool, and some of them even as adults. Over the course of her career with that daycare, she had, at one point, a kid come in that was the grandchild of someone that had gone to it early on. Um, anyway, so that willingness to change, that willingness to explore was really big. And I've been thinking pretty recently about some of the ways that that was concrete. And that started with sort of what seemed like, well, let me back up a second. One of the things here that has made this very interesting to talk about is that through my entire adult life, especially after I started being around a lot more queer people, I would kind of make this little joke about, like, I felt like I had a really good childhood, really good parents, really accepting, wider family, just everyone was really kind, and very accepting. And I would kind of like, well, I don't really want to brag. I kind of even feel guilty about talking about it, because talking about that relative to what I heard from other people, these just immense pieces of trauma that they had carried into their adult lives in a lot of ways. And I came out of childhood, I came out of sixth grade with very little of that trauma. And in retrospect, that was in a large part because my parents worked so hard over that first amount of time, first 12 years or so, to just accommodate me when I needed change, when something wasn't working, as well as when I wanted something, whether that was, when I was in kindergarten, my best friend was a girl and she liked to play with Barbies, and I wanted to play with her, and so I got Barbies. And really loved playing with Barbies, and my parents bought them for me just without any guilt, without any like, okay, but this isn't manly. Just a, that's what works for you. Cool, let's do that. And that manifested over time in a lot of ways that I sort of have, picked out. And this is not a complete list at all, but just some concrete things. And the first one that sort of built this cascade of thinking about them was, in retrospect, fairly minor, or fairly small and simple in a lot of ways. But as I look back, that's true of a lot of these things. And part of why I never really thought about them is that I never thought about, like, oh, here are some very concrete things that I had as a kid that would have helped a lot of other people, or things similar to them would, that it never really occurred to me that, oh, people really didn't get that. People were forced into things that were not working for them, and they carry immense trauma from that into adulthood. So, concrete thing there that first kind of kicked this off was remembering that as about a 4-year-old, 3 or 4-year-old, I want to say, my parents figured out that sitting at the dinner table, just sitting in a chair at the dinner table and eating, did not work for me. I would be super fidgety, I wouldn't eat, I would just like cling onto the chair and want to escape. And so very quickly, my dad built a little wide, solid step stool, so that I could step up, get a bite of food, and then pace back and forth, eating, talking, switching between eating and talking. And they just sort of, like I said, figured out, oh, this works better, let's do this. There was never any like, okay, but this is weird. There was never any guilt. It was purely, this is what works, so let's do that. And I think a lot of that was clarified after preschool, where they had really been in control of things around this. And in retrospect, there are two pieces there. One is that my parents didn't want to have my entire experience of preschool be with my mom. And part of that was just when I was in that preschool, there was this feeling of sort of like, well, okay, I mean, she's your teacher, but she's my mom. Like I have broader rights here. And so they put me part-time into a more conventional preschool. And I always hated my time there, and I never quite put together why. But in retrospect, a lot of it was that they were less accommodating. They were a little less tolerant of strange behavior. And that really became concrete after preschool when they put me into kindergarten. Specifically, they put me into just kind of a standard public school kindergarten. At the same time, I had kind of like wild hair, and sometimes I would wear hair ties, sometimes like flowers in it, and they never questioned that. But what I also did is I would stim by pulling hair and then pricking myself in the lip. And they wanted to stop me from doing that because I was literally picking myself a bald spot. And they hadn't internalized, they didn't know, they'd done research but hadn't really found that, oh, this is stimming, this is a sign of autism. And so what they did is they buzzed my head, and I hated it. I didn't put together at the time why I hated it. I thought it was just, I mean, and it partly was, that they had removed one of my primary stims. But I made up for that by like finding threads, finding whatever I could find and stabbing myself in the lip with them. But the other piece was that that was really the first time I had been exposed to being in an environment that really explicitly expressed those gender norms in ways, or at the very least, I was suddenly being schooled alongside kids that came from a culture with an expectation around gender norms. In addition, I came into a system with very little accommodation around my ADHD, around my autism. Um, and the concrete example of that I remember was for St. Patrick's Day one year, or for one in that year, we had to make a like little leprechaun picture, and it was one of those things where it was like, here's your kit of things to make this leprechaun. Everyone is making the same leprechaun. And I remember just being like, this is so boring that I cannot get myself to do it. And I had a meltdown. Um, and while my parents tried a bunch of things through that sort of conventional schooling over the course of kindergarten to make things work better, and nothing really worked. I do remember talking to counselors and things like that during that time. Thankfully, uh, after kindergarten, they were able to find um, a little hippie school like up in the hills. My first year there, first grade, there were 26 kids in the entire school, and it was on this property that was like a big old farm that had, it was orchard school in the hills above Aptos, California. And it had like a big old apple orchard. It had a bunch of little buildings around it, and that really worked for me in a lot of ways. And part of that was that our play times, even from that early age, were fairly unsupervised. And so we could just sort of wander off and do whatever we wanted. And the class size was so small. I think over my time there, it was usually about 10 kids in a grade. And we would just sort of move from building to building, subject to subject. Um, and we would have things where, like, okay, well, Thursdays are pottery day. So one of our classes is we all go and make pottery. And there's no, like, okay, this is the shape we're making today. It was pretty purely, what skill do you want to learn today? What do you want to make today? Let's make that. Go ahead and make that. Um, and Fridays were like archery day, which in retrospect is, oh, most people didn't get archery day. Um, and and through that, there were also other things that are really, I feel like, looking back, notable. For instance, our math class, the way our math class was structured was that there were a bunch of sort of series of books where each series was some like sub subject of mathematics. Uh, and when we came in for the day, just into each, individual class, basically all of us could just make a decision like, what do we want to learn today? Oh, I feel like learning geometry today. Cool, I'll pick up the book I'm on from the geometry series. And in addition to all that, there was oh, you don't feel like doing math today? There's a table at the back, do art. And with options for what that art looked like, even what medium it was. Um, and alongside that really concrete accommodation was tolerance. It was such a small class size, and so diverse in a lot of ways, although very white. In retrospect, very white. Um, but it was still this this emphasis on there not being an expected way to be, uh, and that put me in a place where, in retrospect, I dressed weird. I had kind of weird gender things. But none of them really stuck out to me at the time because everyone around me, including the other kids, all the way really up to sixth grade, were just like, "Oh yeah, that's dead name. That's just how they are. That's fine." Um, and that was immensely free. Um, and what my parents did right in all that really comes down to just identifying what was working, identifying what wasn't, and then doing that. Another example of that I think is useful, a couple examples really, are that they figured out very well by the time I was 4 at least, that because I said so just did not work with me. Um, I don't know that they ever actually tried it. It's too early. I just know that by 4 at least, they had figured out that what they needed to do was to explain to me in a very adult, measured way why a thing needed to happen. And then almost always my reaction would be, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then I would do it. Um, Another piece that I never quite put together until recently is that my parents, the teachers at my school, all of these people, um, we just used first names. There was no Mrs. whatever, Mr. whatever. And including my parents, I would call them mom and dad, but I could also and would call them from a very early age by their first names. And that was just okay. And what that led to was from a fairly early age, this expectation that conversations between us would be fairly even where possible, would be fairly adult where possible. So all of that just kind of very early treating me as a person, treating me as someone that had agency, and treating me as someone that had needs and could express those needs, or at least could express when something wasn't working, and then working to meet those needs, working to make things easy. When I would info dump, they would sit there and listen. They would ask questions. And those questions, in retrospect, were incredibly anarchist, although they have always identified just as kind of liberal. They never really gave me a huge amount of detail what that meant, although they've always been activists. Um, and so over the course of them listening to me info dump, they would ask questions. They would ask, oh, is that fair to so and so? Oh, could that hurt so and so? Oh, do you need to ask so and so before you do that? Um, and so just this really what it comes down to is treatment as a person with agency who had wants and needs, and they worked to respect that agency. And then they worked to fulfill those wants and needs. Um, and they did that not only with listening, but also with resources and their time. And between all of that, I really came up just feeling like the world would just accept me, feeling like the world would just kind of work with what worked for me. Um, and between all that, coming out of that into 7th grade into another public school was a huge shock. And I can talk about that later.
Sounds good. And I'm really glad that you had such a supportive and loving experience growing up. So, you've said before that you think that your understanding of your dysphoria had more of an ethical basis for you. Could you elaborate more on that for me?
I definitely feel like there was an aspect of ethical problems with gender dysphoria. And although I didn't really identify them at the start because they were so ever present in my life, and that is that my parents really instilled into me a lot of the values that I still hold. Like I said, they really instilled into me, this feeling of being fair to other people, asking them for their permission before I did something that affected them, and all of this. And looking back, my dad has helped with writing specifically textbooks for people in community college, mostly, learning how to be preschool teachers. And one of the core pieces of that is describing how to guide small children, age of 2, age of like just really starting to have language, through the process of sort of fairness, this feeling of like I have wants and needs and I want them to be filled. But with a often not really understanding that the people around you, at least the kids around you, had agency, that they were other people. And so really instilling like, yeah, I hear that you have these wants and needs, but we need to be fair. And that fault comes into thinking about equality, thinking about, okay, it's more fair if everyone gets the same thing. It's more fair if you share that toy for equal amounts of time, if you need to share it, all of that. And then transitioning from that into a understanding of justice, an understanding that it wasn't just about everyone getting the same thing. It was more about everyone understanding what was a want, what was a need, understanding how they could express those best. Obviously, at that point, it was really about 4 when we really got to that point. And understanding some sort of nondescript, never really solidified ideas around the ways it was important to interact with other people. And so I really came out of preschool all the way through childhood with this very strong sense of values, this very strong sense of a way to move through the world that let me minimize harm to other people, that let me move through the world in a way that respected other people and other people's agency. And the problem was that all came crashing down in 7th grade as I was going through puberty. I was suddenly in a more public school where I was much more exposed to gendered expectations. And I went through a lot of difficulty because over the course of those early years, I never really understood, oh, I might not be a boy, because everyone kind of defaulted to, well, they're a boy. And I heard that, and then I never experienced any real dysphoria, any real pushback against my behavior based on me being a boy. And so by the time I was 12, I am a boy was something that was just kind of solidified in my brain. It wasn't a thing that was challenged. And so I went into that, went into puberty. I went into this sudden exposure to kind of mass culture ideas of what it meant to be a boy, and especially what it meant to be moving into manhood through puberty, through teenage years. And I felt, even in that time, although I didn't kind of realize it, that I kept being told that the way to be a boy, the way to be a man, involved things that violated my values, that violated those values that had been instilled in me. But part of the problem at that point was that those values were still very nondescript. I didn't have like concrete ideas of, oh, this is one of my values. And that is something I really actually value, because it pushed me away from, or at least didn't push me toward, a feeling of like, oh, this is the right way to be. Because one of those values was tolerance and acceptance. It was, if someone else around you is doing something that you find weird, well, that's fine. If it doesn't work for you, work out a way to not be touched by it, work out a way that works for you. And so as I progressed through those teenage years, I really felt bombarded with these demands that I try all these ways of being a man, of trying to assert my manhood. And those came not only from popular culture, but from the friends that I made, that I fell in with over middle school. And I kept trying things. I kept being told, you know, to be a man is to do this thing, this is a man thing. Um, and I very much was in a place of just like, I don't understand what manhood means. None of this makes sense to me. But the way I approached that was to try man things. And I would go into that trying a man thing very uncomfortable. I would go into it feeling like something about this doesn't feel like a right thing to do. Um, and then I would do it, and I would be massively uncomfortable. I would hate it, and I would come out of it with two real feelings often. One was, okay, I never want to do that again. That was miserable. And also a lot of self-hatred, just a lot of like feelings of guilt because I would recognize that I had harmed people. I would recognize that I had been unfair to people. Um, but that didn't stop me from moving through manhood up until a much later age, uh, up until early 30s, with this feeling of and this approach of, okay, I still don't know how to be a man. None of this makes sense. Um, Male friendships, especially, just never made sense. There was always this feeling of we can never really get too close. We have to kind of poke back and forth and be a little bit mean to each other. Um, and that just profoundly didn't work for me. I just did not understand it. I hated experiencing it. And also because all of it, because the very nature of it violated my boundaries, violated the boundaries I didn't really know I had. I just felt when they were violated. Uh, I didn't have a good idea of where those boundaries were for other people in those relationships. And so, in trying to be a man and trying to engage in that male friendship, I pretty frequently violated the boundaries of other people because it was like, well, this is already bad. Um, I don't know, is this too bad? Let's try it. And very frequently it would be too bad, and frequently I would hurt people around me. And again, feel immense guilt. And that really built over my teenage years. I sought out, over that time, I really started to dissociate. I fell into EverQuest specifically as a way of just kind of removing myself from a lot of these ethical decisions, from a lot of these in person um, interactions that I felt the most pressure to be manly in. Um, but that didn't pull me away from a sort of broader culture, from interacting largely with people brought up in a broader culture. That always I had this feeling of like, they don't really accept me. There's conflict between us. There's something about me that doesn't work for them. There's something about them that doesn't work for me. I did have close male friendships, and in retrospect, the major thing with one is really what I had, which has been a long-term friendship, which is at this point I say one of two men in the world that I actually trust, was that he was very accepting. He saw the ways that I was weird. He had ADHD, and we just sort of went through things being kind to each other and just being accepting. Um, but all of that repeated trying something that felt like it might be against my values, finding that, yes, indeed, that was against my values, feeling a huge amount of guilt because of it, over time, over my teenage years, really turned into a chorus of voices in my head, not literal voices, but just what I recognized as like parts of my brain uh, being loud that told me to kill myself because I was a terrible person. Um, and so in retrospect, a lot of my experience of gender dysphoria was feeling forced to do things that were against my ethics. Um, and one of the greatest feelings of freedom that I have felt post transition is this immense and very immediate pretty relatively, freedom from that and freedom to just make decisions based on what felt like the the right thing to do, which again, there wasn't like a concrete correct thing in every situation, but a feeling of this accords with my values. And so that escape from dysphoria that hadn't really been concrete, um, was immediate and very, very impactful.
You spoke about your suicidal ideation and the differences between it being an active versus a constant passive desire, as well as how kind of being in a dissociative state for a couple of decades affected that. Could you elaborate more on that and maybe how it affected your time up to coming out?
Yeah, so I really experienced in retrospect two obviously interlinked things around suicidality. The first was that those feelings of constantly violating my values, trying to be a man, was a lot of feelings of guilt, and that manifested into a chorus of voices in my head telling me to kill myself. I couldn't tell you at this point, um, how that sort of interacted with a more basic desire to not exist. But obviously they sort of came up together. And through that also was intense feelings of dissociation. In the early years, that was really reflected in my playing EverQuest, in being able to just focus everything on I am this person in the computer and I can just be them. And, you know, if I'm talking to people, I can just kind of pretend to be a different person. Although I don't recall ever trying a female character. Yeah, and so what I built up was both this chorus and also just this baseline understanding of I don't want to exist. But I left my teenage years, or at least my early teenage years, with this immense certainty that I didn't want to exist, but also with this immense certainty that I didn't want to make my parents sad, because I understood then, although I didn't really have concrete ways of thinking about it, that they had been immensely kind to me, that they cared for me intensely, um, that they loved me, and I really didn't want to make them sad. And what that led to was, in my thinking, there was just kind of this foundation of like, life sucks. I don't want to be doing this. I want to not exist. But I don't want to do anything about it because I don't want to make the people most important to me in the world sad. And that built into this just kind of unexamined belief, understanding that not wanting to exist was not something I really needed to examine because it was just true. And that led to not really seeking out like, hey, is this true for other people? Is this how people understand the world and experience the world? Um, and and from that, that really drove me into a dissociative state in a number of ways. One of those was that over time, especially as I started taking programming classes and taking formal logic classes, I found that when I was just focused on solving technical problems, I lost those feelings of dissociation, or at least I didn't really experience what I now recognize as dissociation as directly, because that was just kind of part of the process. Was, oh, I don't have to think about a self in all this. I'm just thinking about the problem, and my entire working memory and thought process is devoted to thinking about this problem. And so that suicidal ideation is pushed out and is not considered. And over that time, my parents worked to put me through therapy, but that therapy really came at it from this understanding of, oh, this kid is depressed. And so they kept putting me on SSRIs. I tried a bunch of different SSRIs over those times, and none of them really did anything to me. If anything, a lot of this was coming out as some sort of low-level bipolar, and I couldn't tell you at this point whether that was from trauma related to trauma, from something more genetic, from whatever, who the hell knows. I just knew that SSRIs were not working for me, and I just knew that they amplified my periods of mania intensely. Let's see. So so I ended up in this permanent state of sort of not having a self. And again, I didn't recognize that other people didn't move through the world in that way. I would still talk about having a self, I would still talk about myself. But in retrospect, a lot of that was talking about the ways that people around me told me that they saw me. It wasn't any kind of internal experience. And that, especially even in my early 20s, was really concrete because about then I learned about the concept of dissociation. And I looked at it and kind of felt like, oh yeah, that sounds wild. I've never had something like that because I didn't recognize, or because a lot of that writing talked in a large part about the process of entering dissociation, pulling back out of dissociation once periods of trauma were somewhat resolved, etc. And I didn't recognize any of those processes of change because they were never happening for me. At that point, at least, I was just dissociating 24/7. So I would read about dissociation and be like, oh yeah, that sounds wild. I don't want that to happen, in retrospect. Yeah, so what that really led to, what that suicidal ideation came into, what those feelings of dissociation came into, what finding that I could be much happier or at least be much less sad if I just put all my energy into solving problems, technical problems, engineering problems, whatever. I was a TA for a formal logic class for a long time, and that really worked for me. I then, on that professor's advice, tried programming and was immediately like, yes, yes, this is incredible. I am solving these huge, complex problems in ways that demand my full attention, that demand my full working memory. And between that dissociation and that suicidal ideation, I really became stagnant in a large way. Or at the very least, because everything, all of my emotional processing was coming through this very technical way of thinking. It's not that those emotions didn't impact my thinking. It was that I didn't really recognize how I was feeling them. I didn't recognize how they were expressing my thinking or touching my thinking. And I couldn't really, because they were so immaterial, I couldn't really process them. And that put me in a very stagnant place of just kind of making very slow progress around understanding myself. The suicidal ideation meant that when I really tried to think about what I liked, what I wanted, think about myself, it was drowned out by this chorus of voices in my head telling me to kill myself. And I think understandably, I did not like experiencing that and sought escape from it. And one of the frustrating effects from that is that in retrospect, it really limited the ways I could experience the world, and still does. I'm only now really starting to understand how to understand the world, how to experience the world in ways that aren't coming through that lens.
So, you said that you are a very values-based person and that you had done a lot of things in that period that you felt kind of violated your values and that you had grown from that realization. Could you tell us a bit more about how?
So I am a very values-based person. But first, because I was a teenager and just spiraling, and then because of the suicidal ideation, and then after the suicidal ideation was put to bed by starting on Abilify, um, between sort of, or from one thing to the next, I was never really in a place where I could process as an adult, okay, I feel like I'm a values based person. I feel like I approach questions in the world with a, like, is this the right thing to do? Um, and again, not in a like there is a correct thing to do, but in a like, how do I feel about this? Do I want this? Um, do I think this is the right thing to do in this situation, or at least a right thing to do? Um, so there are definitely examples of that I don't really want to talk about here, not because I'm ashamed of them at this point, uh, but because as as I've come out of or post transition, as I've started to realize the ways in which things I had been doing violated my values, as those values became more concrete, although they didn't become really in words concrete until a month ago, in a lot of ways. Um, so the clearest example, the most ever present example, was something I talked about already, was trying to move through male friendships, and both one-on-one, but also just kind of existing in places that were dominantly male. Um, was this feeling of like, okay, the way I exist in this space is to kind of be a dick, uh, and and in that time recognizing that the ways I was doing that did not feel right, and I came out of them feeling immensely uncomfortable, immensely guilty. I would, as part of that, also think that I would see the people around me doing things that I think in ways a lot of people that young didn't really recognize as racist or sexist, and in a lot of ways I didn't either concretely. I just understood that like that's biased, because one of the major themes of my dad's work as a preschool teacher, as a textbook writer around preschool teaching, was explicitly anti-bias curriculum, as it was called at the time. And so there was this feeling of like, this is wrong because, and I didn't have the words again, this is racist, this is sexist, this is something else, this is patriarchal. Um, and and so I would see the men around me expressing these things in kind of subtle ways, or at least not incredibly blatant ways. But because of something I talked about earlier, where all of that was beyond my values, I didn't really understand where other people's values or where other people's boundaries were. And so, on a couple memorable occasions in high school, I said some things to men around me, to try and sort of gain acceptance, to gain membership into manliness, that were profoundly sexist. Um, one that's coming to me in this moment is playing high school PE, and we were playing baseball or softball or something in that area, and a ball went up into the outfield, and um, it went to a girl's sort of area, and she went to catch it and she dropped it. And I said something to the other men in the dugout about, like, that's what you get for putting a girl in the outfield. And immediately felt like, oh my God, that was awful. Um, and to their credit, the men around me were like, dude, um, And that's something that I carried immense guilt for a very long time. But there were other little ways that I really started expressing that sexism, expressing racism, especially in my older years, my I want to say late teens, early 20s. I fell into 4chan. I spent time on B, and that meant that I was surrounded by very casual racism and sexism. And as much as I was scrolling through, I recognized it as that. I felt uncomfortable about it, but it still normalized it in my head as just, oh yeah, that's a thing that people around you will say. Um, and in retrospect and looking back, it encouraged some thinking, especially around racism, that was unexamined, because it was bringing in these very explicitly racist ways of thinking, just sort of accepted facts about the world that, to my parents, to the people around me in my early childhood, were so obviously wrong, that they never really challenged them directly. And so some of those stuck. And I've talked about this publicly in the past, but one of the things I recognized, even pre-transition, was that I had been, since then, since getting out of there, since recognizing the ways that it was affecting my thinking and that I didn't like them, that undoing the harms that had been done to my understanding of justice through that would be the work of a lifetime. And if there's anything that I am fairly proud of as I'm kind of facing down mortality, it is that, to my frustration, I still have to catch those things. But over a lot of years, over making more friends, mostly online, that were black women, that experienced depression in a way that I hadn't really thought about in the past, I came to, I think, really understand a lot of the ways that that community had affected my thinking, and in the ways that those things violated my values, and began to uproot them, began to dig in and pull them out. And something I am proud of is I feel like over my life, I have done that in big ways. My frustration here at possibly the end is that, as I said, there are still things that have been rooted in there that I have to catch. I have to, I will have sort of an immediate reaction, and I have to very quickly be like, no, we do not think that. We do not actually believe that, even if that's somewhere that our brain throws up as, oh, this is a fact about the world. But from the very beginning, like I said, I really saw this as the work of a lifetime, to uproot that, to uproot the effects of broader culture and the ways that it is oppressive, uprooting the effects of the kyriarchy. Yeah, so I think, if anything, those years of violating my own values, feeling immensely guilty about it, especially once I went on the Abilify and could actually think through some of that without the suicidal ideation flooding in and telling me, basically, you've already failed. There is nothing you can do to be a better person because you have already failed. Let me start pulling apart the things I actually felt, the things I actually believed, from some of the things that I had been taught, some of the things that I had picked up from wider culture, from the cultures that I connected with directly. And over time, I built up a more solid sort of understanding of where my own boundaries were, where my own boundaries for my own behavior were, from where my own boundaries for what I would tolerate from the people around me were. And that came out in concrete ways. Most notable, I think, is early on in high school. So like 15, 16, I don't remember exactly where. I had been growing up with some of the teenagers from middle school, teenage boys, as sort of a little, triad of friends. And as all of us got older, they started dating women, dating teenage girls, whatever you want to say. And suddenly I was in this much more concrete culture of people that I respected, people that I at least cared for, talking concretely about things they were doing to, things they were expecting of, etc., their girlfriends, or the girls around them, that I had a very immediate, like, that is not a right thing to do. That is not a fair thing to do. That is not a just thing to do. And fairly on in high school, specifically, one of that triad talked braggingly about, and content warning for rape here, talked braggingly about how he had been fucking his girlfriend, and had slipped out and slipped into her ass, and how, and his celebration, not just of, oh, I like anal, but a celebration of, yeah, I did whatever I wanted with her. And that was this very concrete moment of, oh, this is a person that does not share my values in any concrete way, or in a very concrete way they don't. And at that point, I had a very explicit friend breakup with him, with the other part of that triad as well. The other part of that triad went with him. I wrote him a letter basically saying, like, the way you treat women around you, the way you treat girlfriends is unacceptable to me. I laid out some of why. I don't remember the exact content of the letter. I'm very sure that there were aspects of it that were, I don't know, that were loose thinking, that I would disagree with now, at the very least. Or I would recognize why they weren't expressing a more concrete understanding of the world. Yeah, so really, the way that my much more concrete and clear values have grown is because I violated them so much over the years and had so much experience of having exceeded my own boundaries, and that led to a, over time, increasing picture of where those boundaries were.
So, how do you want to be remembered? Whether it becomes relevant in a week or in a few decades?
How do I want to be remembered? So, I think there are a couple important pieces of here. I want to be remembered as a woman. I want to be remembered as the person that I have built, the person that I have found connection to. And in a lot of ways, I see that as not even so much repairing dissociation, because the self that was on the other side of that dissociation, I have no real connection to. I haven't felt a connection to them, to him. for the last 20 years. And so whether or not you want to think of that as the foundation or just something that's pushed out, I've really felt, especially post-transition, a clarity around building myself, a self, building, building a self. And so what a lot of that comes down to is that I want to be remembered as someone expressing that self. And especially recently, as I face down mortality, as I've sort of made some jokes to myself, I've been handling a lot of this with jokes. Just the memory of this very common joke around death, of like, you're on your deathbed and your best friend is there, your something is there, and you like reach out to them, and in a weak voice you say, "Delete my browser history." And that sort of spurred some thinking about what are ways that I don't want to be remembered? What are things that I've done? What are aspects of the ways I have existed in the world that I don't want to be remembered for? And really realizing that those things were pre-transition, almost universally, things that had violated my values, but also things that, especially as I moved through transition, one of the major themes was slowly from event that I remembered, from general theme of, I felt like I did wrong in this way many times over those years. Putting out apologies, putting out specific apologies to people. And in retrospect, some of that was an apology that served me, not them. And I would do that differently now. But also one of the things that happened through those years, and had really started before those years, is I was still working in tech. But I started to branch out. I started to take the skills that I had built there and really incorporate them into expressing my values. And since then, I've built a lot of tools that I'm proud of. One of the things that I embraced very early, especially because one of my jobs in tech, one of the sort of themes in tech that's talked about all the time, is automate everything. Is if something is a common task, figure out what tools you can build to make it easier, as easy as possible, as just done as possible. And one of the major points, one of the things that I want to be remembered for, is that I have endeavored over these intervening years to use the skills that I built in tech to build tools that make doing the right thing easier. I really saw, especially around alt text in my early times, really, of understanding accessibility. It was in 2020, I had built some more direct relationships with leftists, and specifically anarchists, communities on Twitter especially. And so people there started talking about alt text, and I very quickly was like, oh yeah, that's a thing I haven't been thinking about, but that's important. That is something that is important according to my values, but I didn't realize that it's a way I had been violating them, which is a theme through life, and I'm sure through my current life. That is just a fact of existing in the world, is that our incomplete understanding will frequently, or at least sometimes, come out as doing harm in ways that we didn't expect or don't understand or don't see. Anyway, so I understood that it was important, but as someone with ADHD, especially, I would very frequently forget to include it and wouldn't remember until someone in my community came in, half an hour later, whatever, and was like, you forgot. Uh, and one of the natures of Twitter, of course, is that at that point, at least, it wasn't editable in any way. And because posts there are so momentary, so there was always this feeling of like, okay, I fucked up there. I wish I could fix it, but my options are either to delete it, which I chose sometimes, to delete it and repost it with alt text, or just like, I posted that picture, it got 2 likes, and then it vanished to the bottom of my timeline. There's no reason for me to repost that. And yeah, and in that, very often I would just delete it. But one of the things that I saw as I explored that was that there were bots out there that you could enlist the services of to remind you. One of the major ones, and I apologize, I don't recall the person who made it, but one of the major ones that had a pretty large following had broken maybe a year earlier due to some Twitter API changes. And then another one, and that one, and one that still existed, that still worked, although it had a low following, both worked by replying under the post. They were slow. They wouldn't reply for 5 minutes or somewhere in there. And so one of my immediate reactions to that was, oh, this is a place I think I can build a tool to help myself. And I want to do that in 2 ways. I want to make that immediate as possible. I want to know in time to go back, delete it, repost with alt text before anyone sees it, or at least before as few people as possible see it. And then also, I want to make that handling in DMs so that there wasn't this feeling of public shame. There was, oh, I've enlisted this tool and it's helping me. I don't need to feel bad when I miss the mark. Because in my experience, that public shame often pushes you away from, in a desire to not feel it, pushes you away from fixing it. Or at least makes it much more work to get yourself to fix it. And so I made alt text reminder. And with the way it worked originally, it had a limit of, I think, 10 subscribers. And I made it for myself. And so it was just kind of like, well, this is a tool for myself, but hey, I recognize that people around me could use it. And so I offered it to a couple big accounts. And they signed on, and then as they signed on, as they started talking about it, I got a steady flood of people coming in and saying, oh, I want that, oh, I want that, oh, that would be really useful. And so I figured out, okay, here's other ways I can do this that accept more people, and I do that fairly quickly. And I remember, and something that I think I'm very proud of, something that is a small detail, but I'd love to be remembered, is that within 24 hours of releasing the version of that bot that could accommodate more than just a few people, I had several hundred users from across the world who very immediately asked me, like, oh, can I have reminders in my language? And some very immediate volunteers to do that translation for me. One of the other aspects there that's maybe worth mentioning as something that I'm proud of is that those public reply bots, those public reminder bots, replied in a very not condescending, not insulting way, but a very sort of conciliatory way, a very like, you don't need to feel guilty about this, just, go back and fix it, it's okay. And that didn't work for me. I think possibly in retrospect due to some neurodivergence things. What I wanted was not a, you haven't really fucked up, you haven't really missed the mark, it's okay, you don't need to be mad at yourself, was just something that said, hey, you did this thing. And that felt like it pulled in much less emotion and much less guilt into going back and fixing it. So over time, the user base of that bot grew and grew, and this is something that I would like to be remembered by, even if Twitter in later years really went off the rails. Is that the success of that bot by the end of its lifetime, I think it had in the vicinity of 30,000 users. The reason that lifetime came to an end is that the success of that bot had gotten me an invite to the Twitter Developer Insiders group, which was a very small, I think 8 people in the original panel group of outside developers who used the Twitter API in various ways to sign an NDA and then have previews of API changes coming down the pipe, to provide feedback on those changes, to provide ideas. And my access to that access both got me through a number of places where that bot would exceed a rate limit, would get temporarily suspended for doing something, etc., etc. It gave me this very ready access to a developer relations person to go to support and get that fixed that day. Anyway, through that program, through that influence, through the success of that bot, something that I'm very proud of, something that I'd like to be remembered for, is that Twitter shifted their roadmap in order to build that bot's functionality directly into the platform. And one of the things that was interesting to me in that was that I got a lot of feedback from people, or I got a lot of conciliatory, not apologetic, but losing words with this brain tumor. It's very frustrating. A lot of people expected me to be sad and wanted to console. There we go. And there was always this feeling of like, okay, but building it into the platform makes it more accessible to people. It makes it easier to find. Cool. And so retiring that bot was something I was immensely proud of. It's something I'd like to be remembered for, is that I spurred a concrete change towards accommodation of disabled people's needs from a major company. And that felt immense. And that was also one of the, come back to that. The other thing that came through that is I started to be more exposed to the community that had built around alt text on Twitter, actually talking to blind people, because that wasn't something I had really done. In retrospect, because I had started from this very self-centered perspective and providing a tool specifically for people writing alt text, I started to see that I was not getting the full picture of what was useful, what was needed. And from that, I started to build a bot. I built a bot that was more multifunctional. At first, it started as something that was when journalists were out in the field, which as someone that was really involved with leftist communities, I was pretty involved with. When independent journalists were out in the field live tweeting something, they just straight up did not have time to write alt text. And so I wrote a bot to basically do what alt for me does on Blue Sky, which is when one of those people posted without alt text, it would send out a notification to say, hey, come help here. And then later that bot, that usage failed utterly. It just, there wasn't the concrete basis or foundation for it, community foundation for it. But I started to use that as just sort of what other tools are useful. And I started building those tools into that bot. And one of the major ones was optical character recognition. It was taking a picture of text and extracting readable text by a screen reader. And recognizing, oh, hey, I intended this. I thought of this as a tool for other sighted people, other people writing alt text as they just like, oh, make it a little bit easier to deal with pictures of text with inserting alt text for them. And then pretty immediately recognize like, oh, this is actually a tool for blind people, for visually impaired people, because they, on coming on across an image with no alt text, but hints that it would be text, or just trying it out to see, had access to a bot to extract it. So that was another place where even after the reminder bot was retired, I still felt like I was contributing to that community. I was contributing tools that made doing the right thing easier. I was contributing tools to disabled people to make their experience of the platform easier. And that was something I'm immensely proud of. One of my great frustrations with all this now, which with things that I can only now recognize, oh, that was the tumor growing, are that I had a grand idea for a shared library of alt text, a way of, so often the same meme, the same GIF, like, gets posted 10,000 times. And there are details about, like, okay, what's good alt text in this context, etc. So this was not perfect, and I recognize that. But just having access to a library that was searchable by image, not with words, for, is there alt text for this picture already written? Both as if you're posting the picture, can you find something quickly, maybe that's better than what you would write? I wanted it to be publicly editable, so if you posted something that was likely to be reused and there was no text for it, you could add your own. If you came across text for an image that you felt was substandard, you could contribute your own for other people to see and other people to maybe choose. And one of my great frustrations is that the effects of the tumor in those early years, although that was more mid-years of the tumor effects, really prevented my ability, or at least interfered with my ability to finish that project. And one of the things that I am proud of as I'm here facing down mortality, or at the very least, a knowledge that I will never be back to a place where I can finish that project. That's just not a possibility with what I'm facing down, whether or not I live through whatever process I go through in the near future. One of the things that I am proud of is a willingness to seek other people, other communities to carry on that work. Stepping out of that quite long answer about things I've built, about how I've been, the way that I've existed in the world post-transition, I want to be remembered as someone that took care of the people around her, that cared deeply about the people around her, and about the beliefs that I had about the world, about the beliefs that I had, the values that I had about what made the world just, what could make the world a more just place. And then in a a statement that I've only really made concrete, that's only really crystallized recently. A belief that basically, for all that I said that I held values, those values were meaningless. Those values were not really held unless I was willing to sacrifice, to take risks, to put in work, to express those values, to work towards those values. And so one of the ways I want to be remembered is as someone who put in work, who took risks, who sacrificed her own comfort, a number of things over the years, to expand those values. And I recognize in retrospect that some aspects there were not healthy. There was a lot of people pleasing because over the years, I didn't want to live for myself. I didn't want to live. And so I built up a lot of finding joy in the world by making other people happy. And in retrospect, and in a more concrete choice as I moved through the world, and as I moved through transition and moved to see that there were aspects there that were people pleasing, that were not actually worthwhile, and in some case that still violated my values, primarily around starting to offer help, starting to provide help without really checking in on what was needed, what was useful. Yeah, so I'd really like to be remembered as someone that expressed my values, as someone that lived my values, as someone that cared deeply about the community around me, as someone that prized cooperation over competition, as someone that was willing to be herself, that was willing to not hide the parts of myself that I had been hiding for so long because I was ashamed of them, because I saw them as not manly, because I saw them as opponents to be defeated rather than goals to be sought, things to work toward. I wanted to be remembered as someone that was willing to change her mind, someone that was willing to hear values that I disagreed with, thinking that I didn't understand, stories that were out of line with my experience of the world, and be willing to incorporate them into my understanding of the world, my understanding of my own values, sometimes modifying those values as I learned to understand them more deeply. So I'd really, in part, like to be reminded or like to be remembered as someone who was willing to work with people that I disagreed with in big and small ways, and to, in part, because thinking about things through that sort of engineering brain put me in a place where very often or very rarely was I triggered by interactions with other people. I would like to be remembered as someone that could have very straightforward, very honest, very good faith conversations about contentious issues with people that I disagreed. One of my great frustrations here at the end, especially, is seeing how rare that is in a lot of ways, and a great frustration around expressing that into the world and expressing that when in conversations with people with whom I disagree, sometimes in foundational ways, and seeing the ways that our culture, especially our culture's focus on competition, has shaped a conversation, especially on social media, where there's sort of not this expectation of connection before discussion of complex issues. Seeing the ways that willingness to cooperate, that willingness to consider change, that willingness to hear other people's stories was not really prized in wider culture. It was very prized in the circles that I chose to surround myself in, and finding those circles and finding through that deeper connections with people around me that I sometimes very foundationally disagreed with, but still being able to coexist with them, still being able to tolerate what I saw as harmful behavior, and tolerate over time, especially as I saw them working towards ways that I saw as alleviating that harmful behavior. I want to be remembered as someone that in a lot of ways over time helped people close to me embrace their own values and be more willing to cooperate. That is something immensely, immensely important to me. And then finally, so I to summarize all that, I want to be remembered as someone who has been away in the world, that has moved through the world in a particular way. I want to be remembered for the things that I've built. And I also want to be remembered sometimes just for the things that I've done, just the little experiences that I've had, the moments of connection that I've had with the people around me. I would really like them especially to carry that in their hearts, whether our relationship was a deep connection, whether our relationship was just sort of comets meeting up with each other occasionally, or whether that connection was parasocial. I would like to be remembered as someone who did their best, who did her best. Still have to fix that in myself sometimes. To live her values, to be what she saw as a good person in a way that she thought about very concretely, in a way that she really thought about before taking an action. I would like to be someone seen as considering the effects of my actions before taking them, even if, as I sort of recognized earlier in my life, that frequently meant that I was much slower to come to decisions than other people around me. So all of that is to say that I want to be remembered for the things I've done, the adventures I've had, the interactions I've had with people around me. I want to be remembered for the things I've built, whether that is tools, like I said, for making doing the right thing easier, or simply just cool, fun things. Things that make a day a little bit lighter. Things that express an idea that I think is funny. And things that I've been. Things about the ways that I have existed in the world. And in some of my writing, as I face down mortality, have really been on those three. I want to be remembered for the things I've done, the things I've built, and the things I've been.
Do you have any memories of the people in your life, the people that you love, anything that you'd like to talk about specifically?
There are definitely aspects of memories of people, specific memories of specific people in my life that I would like to be remembered for. The one that has taken me the longest to forgive myself for, that's had the most steps in that forgiveness, is forgiving myself for how I behaved in my 15-year relationship with my wife, with whom I am now basically separated. We still call each other our wives. We still celebrated our 15th anniversary last August. But all of that with a very explicit expectation that none of this was romantic. We were celebrating the connections we had in the past. And one of my great frustrations was this feeling of having transitioned too late in that process to really repair, because I wasn't in a place. Well, the way I talk about it now is understanding more about that dissociation. I wasn't there. There was no me there. I was just in the world, driving kind of randomly, trying out things, finding they didn't work. I was someone who generally wanted to disappear, wanted to take up very little space, wanted to not be a burden on the people around me. But also, there were a lot of ways in which I took up immense amounts of space, especially, and asked for a lot without really giving much in return from my wife and from other women that I dated. So one of the things that I would like to be remembered for, and that especially my wife, who I have talked to a lot around this, is I'd like to be remembered with love, even by the people that I harmed in the past, because of what I've worked for on repair in that. The ways in which, even where that repair wasn't possible, I have worked towards never doing them again. And that all has been crucial in coming to a place where I could forgive myself for being that way. Although an important part of that is, in a very real way, seeing pre-transition me as dead, in a lot of ways of never really having existed as a person. I want to be remembered by the community around me for being someone that people who are in distress, who are in crisis, could come to, not necessarily for advice, although very frequently people asked for advice, or at least when I offered it, would take it, but just as someone who would be there with them through it, who would listen to them talk about it, who would hug them when they needed it, who at times would act as a go-between between them and people involved in that crisis. So I'd really like to be remembered as someone that took care of the community around her. I'd like to be someone that's remembered by people further out in my experience of the world, especially post-transition, as someone that worked toward justice, especially around homelessness. I saw a lot of injustice very immediately. I saw a lot of people living lives that I very concretely understood they should not have to. They shouldn't be forced into. And seeing that the alternatives that they were offered, were themselves unjust. And seeing that the people in my wider community whose reaction to homeless people's existence, in short, was unjust and often very counter to the way that they talked about their own values. And seeing that a lot of that was very simply that for a lot of people immediately in my life, parts of my community, other people in the wider world, just fundamentally didn't see everyone around them as possessing agency. I want to be remembered as someone who saw everyone around her, to the extent that I could, as possessing agency, as deserving to be a whole person, and as deserving to be someone that could be themselves, that I didn't need to use positions of power that I possessed to force them into any conformity in any way. I want to be remembered as someone who moved through the world in a just way. And that is something that I have worked through my entire lifetime toward. And it's something that here at possibly the end, I feel like I've met. Um, there are still parts of me that I recognize as imperfect, but one of my core values is forgiveness, and that forgiveness includes myself. That forgiveness includes a willingness to see that I have done, that I am still doing things that I know are harmful, that I know are out of line with my values, but sitting in nothing but guilt about them is in fact an impediment to my fixing them, impediment to my doing better next time. Um, I want to be remembered as someone who put in work to live my values and put in work making changes in myself and in the wider world to live my values.
How do you feel regarding your knowledge of mortality at this point, of having to come to terms with the fact that you may pass away during your surgery?
Yeah, so I have definitely been considering a lot about mortality in the last few weeks, especially as this tumor diagnosis was so sudden and also so advanced, um, to the point where I've gotten a lot of feedback. I don't know. Um, I've had a lot of people come to me with with comfort, telling me that this surgery will make things better. I hope that you will be better. You'll have a better experience of the world after the surgery. And what I finally was able to pin down about it is that this surgery is very much not a fix-it surgery. This surgery is not a surgery that makes things better. This surgery is a thing that possibly stops things from getting worse while also making other things definitely worse. Specifically around language, specifically around my ability to communicate ideas to other people, which, as someone who felt that her values were so important and felt that expressing those values was so important, is terrifying. But that said, in considering why, in so many ways, especially having very close friends around me with a lot of experience around death, something that they remarked on fairly early is how quickly I was working through things. And I really have picked out three aspects of that. Um, sorry, four. Uh, and the first three are from much earlier experience over that lifetime. Um, the most basic, and something that I had never really thought about, although I'd always been an atheist or agnostic, uh, other than some brief dabs and like, does this work for me? No, not really. Um, and having come up in Jewish culture with a emphasis on willingness to question, um, although a fairly agnostic Jewish culture, with at least my parents, was that I was taught from a very early age about death and about the fact that I was mortal and that the people I loved around me were mortal and that my time with them was limited, but also that that process, that process of birth and life and death was part of a larger cycle, and part of just the way that the world was. Um, and I'm not saying I always really accepted that, but in a funny way, as a teenager, I remember my favorite play was Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. It's unfortunate that Stoppard supported J.K. Rowling. That made me sort of put that play down. But anyway, there's a line in that play basically saying that people are born into the world with a knowledge of their own mortality. And my dad, I told this to my dad, I quoted it, and he, as someone with a master's in developmental psych, both knew that that wasn't really true, and also had a story for me um, about the moment, the very concrete moment where I learned that I would die. Um, and that was going to visit my grandmother when I was about 4. Um, and I really didn't want to go. Probably probably for reasons that at this point I would recognize as neurodivergent. I really hated travel and being away from my space, um, being away from places that I felt like I had somewhere to retreat to. Anyway, so I was expressing, having a bit of a meltdown about not wanting to go, not wanting to go see my grandmother, who lived on the other side of the country, so we didn't see very often. Um, and my dad, to his great credit, my parents had figured out by then, like I think I said, that the way to change my behavior was not to say, because I said so. It was not to say you're doing this or else, or threaten me in any way. It was just to explain in a very adult and measured way, as much as possible, why a thing needed to happen. Uh, and so in this case, he said, well, your grandma is going to die someday. And it's important that we spend the time with her that we can. It's important that we get to know her better before she dies. Um, we get to know her stories. Uh, we get to hear about how she saw the world. Um, and I my dad says that I sort of stopped and thought about that for a little bit, pulled out of the meltdown very quickly, and started asking questions. I asked, will this aunt die? Will this other person die? Will these cousins who are about my age die? And then I got around to, will you and mom die? And my dad, through all of this, through every question, will this person die? His answer was yes. Very matter of fact, not apologetic, just yes. Um, and then finally, without being able to vocalize the question, I just pointed at myself in sort of a questioning way. And my dad, in a more comforting way, said, yes, you will die someday. And then my meltdown really continued. I could not deal with that. But at the very least, it planted a seed. And that seed was watered by the ways that my parents talked about death over my young childhood and early years as, like I said, just kind of part of the cycle. There was never any emphasis on afterlife as an important thing. They didn't deny that there was an afterlife. I heard my mom told me a story about her trying out something Christian, I don't remember what, and as part of that, as a young person, and bringing, as she learned about hell, bringing to her father, who was a staunch atheist, this idea of like, I need to save you, I need to make you believe, because otherwise you're going to hell. And at some point in that, she talked about how he got so sick of her trying to convert him that he, in a very forceful way, was like, stop trying to convince me of this. When I die, I will rot and the worms will eat me. And my mom put that forward as sort of not something that she disagreed with, but something that it was like, oh yeah, that's something that your papa, who is an immense figure of respect in a lot of ways, said. And that is someone that is worth trusting. That's a thing that's worth thinking about. And there is no afterlife. There was never any enforcement of belief. Just that we didn't really talk about an afterlife as an important thing. We talked about death as part of the cycle of life. And that came out in other concrete ways, like when a creature of some sort would die in the yard of my mom's home daycare, she would talk, especially, and I noticed this later, she would talk about, like, oh, well, we're going to have a death week. We're going to talk about death to a bunch of 2 through 5 year olds. And to do that, they would like build a little altar for the deceased creature. They would bury the deceased creature. And they would talk about what that creature's life was like. They would talk about what would happen to its body now that it was dead. And they would talk about how that was part of the cycle. I don't know if she talked directly about the fact that those kids were mortal, but there was just kind of this overarching message that death was a part of life, that death was not something to really be feared, but something to be accepted, that there wasn't some state of perfection that I needed to reach before death in order to have succeeded at life. So I think that kind of baseline, death as a part of the cycle, was very crucial. On a less pleasant note, 20 years of wanting to not exist makes you come away with a lack of a fear of death, even if you no longer want it. And I don't. Very quickly after transition, I noticed one day that I didn't want to die anymore, that I wanted to live, which, makes all this very frustrating. Anyway, so there was those two, the cycle, the lack of fear of death. I am forgetting kind of the third major factor there that played in over time. I'll have to think about it a bit more. Oh, no, that's what it was. It was just kind of this message that what happened after death was unknowable. There might be an afterlife. It might just be that we rot and the worms eat us. It might be any number of things. But also that meant that it shouldn't affect the way that we moved through the world too much. We should live for the life that we had, that we knew. On top of that, in a much more recent way, was Gaza, was the genocide in Gaza. Because after the first sticker art specifically, that I made, I released on October 8th. It was a silhouette of one of the walls around Gaza with a tower and barbed wire and all of that. And across the wall was occupation as provocation. And the actual format of that first draft was not good. I came back to it and produced something much better. But that was starting from a place of anger. And that anger at the injustice of the world, at the unjust way that I saw a country that I had felt connection to as a Jew, unexamined connection, because knowledge of the history of Israel, of the history of Palestine, was not hidden from me, but not really discussed. Absent one memorable event when I was maybe 14, where I went to visit my more Jewish relatives on the other side of the country, and an aunt and uncle of some sort started encouraging me to take a birthright trip. And at the time I was like, oh, a free trip out of the country for the first time, that sounds really cool. And I'd heard all these neat things about like what it was like to exist in a Jewish culture, in an overarchingly Jewish culture. which was always something that, oh, we had some Jewish friends and it was nice to be around them, but we were never in a dominantly Jewish culture. In part because we weren't religiously Jewish particularly, although we did like celebrate the high holy days. So after that aunt and uncle tried to tell me about that birthright trip, my dad pulled me aside and said, um, "You can go if you want. We'll support you in that. But before you decide whether or not you want to go, here are some things that you should know about the history of Israel." I don't remember how he phrased it exactly, but the history of the land that we now call Israel. Um, and based on that, I started to build up a picture, although it took a long time to sort of root out all the ways that I didn't understand the effect that Israel had on Palestinians. But there was just this feeling of like, maybe Israel is not good. That was relatively new, because it had always been, like I said, just like, oh, that's the Jewish place that I want to go someday. And that wraps around to the genocide, the recent sort of click forward in the wheels of genocide. Because in the months prior to that, I had started to internalize a love of ceremony, an understanding of the ways that ceremony helped me move through the world. In retrospect, part of that being that the tumor had started to affect my memory in big ways, and my executive function. So having sort of things that I did every day that I didn't have to think about let me move through the world much more simply. And in seeking that, in seeking ceremony in my life, where I turned was reconnection with Jewish culture, because that had been so important through my childhood in a lot of ways. And I had been really exploring that and building connections to Jewish groups, over those 6 months or so before October, that I had a lot of hope around. It really felt like I was finding a community that was important to me, that helped me in ways. And what happened very immediately was I watched so many people, family, friends, people that I had just been building connections with, have a reaction of intense nationalism around Israel. They gathered in the aftermath, the first few days after October 7th, waving Israeli flags and talking about how Israel had been wronged, and how Hamas had started it. And I very quickly was like, I know enough to know that that's not true, and felt an immense anger at what felt like betrayal. All these people that I had trusted, that I had loved, that I was starting to build a connection to, turning out to very suddenly be so divorced from my values, so, for lack of a better word, monstrous, who believed things about the world that I saw as immensely harmful. And I think in part because of that, I went for the first 2 weeks, 10 days, somewhere in there, with nothing but anger. Just immense anger. And there was sadness there, for sure. There was grief there, for sure. But it was so welled up behind the anger, in part because it felt inadequate. It felt like, well, I don't know how to express this grief in a way that is adequate to capture the horrors happening in the world right now, the things that Israel is doing, um, the ways the Palestinian people are being treated and harmed. Um, and it was finally reading an essay by Amanda Galender, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, called Kaddish for the Soul of Judaism. A Kaddish, for those who don't know, is a prayer of mourning. Um, and in it, there was a single paragraph. A lot of it spoke to me, but there was a single paragraph that I read, and then I read, and I read, and I read, and I read over and over again in that first read through. And I'm going to quote it, although I'm probably going to get it wrong because I don't have it on hand. But I want to say the mourner's Kaddish for every soul killed in Gaza. It may take me a while, because each person has a name. I will sit Shiva for 1,000,000 lifetimes. I will leave a stone on each martyred grave to root the dead back into the earth, but I can still hear the screaming, and I am trying to pray. And on reading that and rereading that, I felt the grief inside me suddenly flood out into the world, and I cried for hours. I finally had another way of understanding the vast injustice that I saw happening in the world. And later, trying to console another Jewish woman going through a very similar process of what I now recognize, and what I recognize in consoling her, as basically this feeling of the grief that I feel, the grief that I can express, is inadequate. It cannot live up to a grief that is enough. And what that paragraph said is that there is not enough. You cannot express enough. There is nothing you can do with a lifetime, let alone 1,000,000 lifetimes, to express the grief coming from this moment that is justified by this moment. And shortly after that, I actually found another essay by a pair of Palestinian folks called Grief Beyond Language. I apologize, I don't remember their names, but that should be findable. Which of course was a very concrete statement of that, just saying in exact terms that not only was there no language to express this grief, but there could not be an adequate understanding of that grief, that we were stuck in expressing the grief we felt however we could, and it would never be enough, but expressing that grief would get us to a point where we could connect with the people around us also feeling that grief, that we could work through that grief, not letting it go, but not letting us impinge on our ability to act toward repair, act toward repairing the world in whatever little ways we could. Yeah. And so all of that happened only a few months before this diagnosis. And when I got the diagnosis, it meant that I already had this very immediate feeling of, this is a moment of intense grief. And there is no amount of grief that I can feel in this moment that can capture the grief that comes from being told that you might have 4 to 6 weeks to live. Especially as someone who only about a week before the diagnosis had come to a point where not only was I experiencing joy for the first time as post transition, or at least as an adult, but that New Year's Eve, the New Year's Eve of 2023 into 2024, was the first time that I had taken the self that I had been building, the self that I had been sort of brushing aside, things that had been hidden about it for so long, and brought it into myself. It was a moment where that became me. And in that same moment was looking over that self and loving it, loving myself for the first time. And literally 7 days later, I had the seizure that resulted in the diagnosis here. And so I had this rapid swing of intense joy, intense feelings about the future opening up. Now that I had a self, now that I could move through the world better understanding how that self felt, how that self experienced the world. And having that suddenly disappear, having that suddenly go to a much shorter, possibly much, even if it wasn't shorter, much worse place, much worse experience of the world, that I was prepared to express grief that I didn't feel I could ever express enough. And so between those four things, in that moment, I felt much more able to move through that grief, through those moments of hopelessness, through those moments of anger about injustice, of the injustice of the whole thing, to a place of thinking about, well, what do I want to do with whatever time I have left? How do I want to be in the world? What do I want to experience? What do I maybe want to build? What do I want to be in what little time I have left as this self that I have built and the abilities that I have in this moment? Yeah, that's how I've dealt with it.
And our last question today is, do you have any thoughts that you would like to pass on specifically? Anything that you feel that you've learned over your life, etc., that you really want to make sure gets given to other people?
So I've talked a lot about the ways that I have worked on moving through the world, that I wish more people not with the same thinking as me, not with the same experience of the world, or seeking the same experience of the world necessarily, but some just core beliefs that I wish I could see more prevalent. I've talked about finally coming to a place where I could value myself and love myself. And from that, I wrote a eulogy for the self that I might get to spend so little time being, and get to spend so little time unencumbered being. And if there's anything I can leave with, anything I can finish with, I think that it's reading that eulogy, because it captures not only the memory of the self that I want to leave the people around me with, but also understanding of the world that I think is worth hearing, that I hope other people will consider and fold into their own in the ways that they connect with it. So I think I'm just going to read you that eulogy as an end to this. I would have liked to have lived longer. I wonder what else I would have gotten to experience, to build, to be. I would have liked to eat too many peaches again, to eat more good watermelon and tagine. I would have liked to gather with friends and dance with wild abandon for hours until our years when our bodies were no longer able, then gather and laugh about those old times. I would have liked to spend more summer nights on the porch in a sundress, just being. I would have liked to kiss some and hug others tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, but all of those things would still be true if I made it to 138. I would have liked to spend as many years as possible moving through the world, in good times and hard, alongside the people I loved, who loved me back with nothing to hide. I would have liked to get to know all of you better, to hear more of your stories and tell you mine, probably multiple times. I would have liked to laugh and cry and go on more adventures together. My time is done, but I hope that you will hold my memory in your hearts. I hope you will spread my art on signposts, water bottles, and wherever else you can around the world. I hope you will read the ideas and stories that I leave. I wish I had time to write down more. I hope you remember me and be kind when you can, to yourself and others. I hope you forgive when you can, yourself and others. I hope you will wield power with as much care as possible. I hope you will seek out new ideas, maybe folding them into your own. I hope you will seek out and listen to others' stories and their understanding of the world. I hope you will fight for justice. Fight whether it's against fascists in the street or for the oppressed everywhere. I hope you will ask what's needed for yourself and others before you make decisions. I hope you will think about what your goals are and consider, when you can, how each of your options moves toward those goals. I hope you will see pleas for help and not just pass them by. I hope you will work to build community, get to know your neighbors, and be willing to disagree on some things but cooperate when you can. I hope you will work to find what brings you together with others before you argue about what pushes you apart. Hard times are coming. For many, they've been here a long, long time. I hope you find action despite grief. I hope you find action despite despair. Don't just tell people you support them, but give them your time and resources if you can. Be willing to take risks for them, maybe of physical harm. If you are unwilling to work or sacrifice or risk for your values, you do not have values. I don't think that anything follows this life. Only the overlapping patterns that have been me, fading to the non-existence that I wished for so long. I leave finally wanting to stay, but knowing that I will be turned back into earth to be a part of the cycle. I leave loving the self that I built. I leave proud of what I put into the world. I leave a joyful woman. Octavia E. Butler told us that all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And perhaps I'm meeting God after all. And that is something that I would love heard, something that I would like to leave people with here, whether or not I'm alive in a little over a week or not. And thank you so much for listening.